The road that cuts through the Ozark Hill country doesn't look like the kind of road where things go wrong. It's 2 lanes mostly, bordered by old-growth oak and hickory that in summer press so close to the pavement you can hear branches scraping the roof of a slow-moving car. It's the kind of road locals drive without thinking, muscle memory carrying them through the curves. And it was on exactly this kind of road, on a Tuesday morning in early September, that 2 girls in the same small Missouri town disappeared within hours of each other, and where, 16 months later, a search party found them inside a farmhouse that, according to county records, had been vacant for over a decade. One of the girls was 17. The other had just turned 15, and the 15-year-old was 7 months pregnant. What the investigators found in that farmhouse in the weeks that followed would raise questions that no one in Harlow County has been able to fully answer. Not the sheriff's department, not the state police, not the families. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. To understand how this happened, you have to understand Harlow County first. Not as a place where something like this happened, but as a place where, for a very long time, almost nothing happened at all. Harlow County sits in the southern stretch of the Missouri Ozarks, about 40 miles east of the Arkansas border. The population in the county seat, a town called Delwood, hovers somewhere around 4,000 people. There's a Dollar General, a grain elevator, 2 gas stations, a volunteer fire department, and a Baptist church that's been in the same building since 1912. People who grow up in Delwood tend to either leave in their 20s or stay for the rest of their lives. There's not much of a middle path. The families of the 2 girls, we'll call them Claire and Madison, were part of the latter category, deep-rooted, in the way that small Ozark towns produce. People whose grandparents' names are on the headstones in the same church cemetery where their own parents were buried. Claire's father worked at a timber supply company 20 minutes outside of town. Madison's mother was a part-time bookkeeper for a local feed store. Neither family was wealthy. Neither was struggling in any notable way. By every account that was later collected, both girls were unremarkable in the very best sense, meaning they had normal lives, normal friendships, normal routines. Claire was 17 and had been talking about cosmetology school. She had a habit of leaving half-drunk cups of sweet tea on the kitchen counter, and her mother, in the weeks after she disappeared, kept finding them, old ones she'd missed, and not being able to bring herself to throw them away. Madison was 15 and had recently started playing guitar, badly by her own admission, and her younger brother would later tell investigators that she'd been working on the same 3 chords for months and refused to move on until she had them exactly right. These are the kinds of details that are easy to overlook in a case like this. They are also, in some ways, the most important ones, because they remind you that before this became a case, these were just 2 people who were living their lives on an ordinary Tuesday in September. The morning they disappeared, Claire had a dentist appointment. She'd been rescheduling it for weeks, but her mother had finally put her foot down, and so Claire had agreed to go on the condition that afterward she could stop at a gas station and get a fountain drink. Her mother said yes. That was the last conversation they had in person. Claire drove herself in the family's second car, a 2009 Honda Civic with a cracked rear bumper, and according to the dental office's records, she arrived on time, had her cleaning, and left at approximately 10:40 in the morning. She never came home. Madison's timeline is slightly harder to reconstruct, because Madison wasn't supposed to be anywhere in particular that morning. It was a teacher in service day, which meant no school. Her mother had left for work early, and Madison's plan, as best as her family could recall, was to stay home and practice guitar. But at some point between 8 in the morning and noon, she left the house. Her guitar was still on the couch. Her phone was still charging in the kitchen. Her shoes, all of them except 1 pair, were still by the front door. What's important here is not just that 2 girls disappeared on the same day. What's important is the geography. Claire's house was on the north end of Delwood. Madison's was on the south end. The dental office was on the main highway, roughly in the middle, and the farmhouse where they would eventually be found was 12 miles outside of town, down a county road that, depending on who you ask, most people in Delwood either rarely use or have never been down at all. The initial response from the Harlow County Sheriff's Department was, by most accounts, measured. Claire's mother called the department at around 2 in the afternoon when Claire hadn't returned and wasn't answering her phone. Madison's mother called at around 5 when she got home from work to an empty house. By the time deputies were connecting the two disappearances, it was nearly evening. The first official explanation, offered informally by a deputy and later echoed at a brief press conference, was that the girls may have left voluntarily. Claire was 17 and described by one official as having shown some signs of restlessness in recent months, a detail her mother disputed, and that appears to have been based on a single comment Claire made to a school counselor about wanting to move to a bigger city after graduation. Madison, at 15, was younger, but the department noted that in some cases involving teenage girls, what appeared to be a disappearance was in fact a choice. They asked the public to remain calm. They said they were pursuing leads. At the time, this seemed reasonable. Teenagers do sometimes leave. It happens in small towns, where the walls can feel like they're closing in. The families didn't accept the explanation, but the official posture was that there was no immediate evidence of foul play. Claire's car hadn't been found. No witnesses had come forward. There were no signs of a struggle at either home. That last part, about no signs of a struggle, is where the first quiet contradiction appears. Madison's shoes. All but one pair were still at the house. Anyone who has thought about this for more than a moment will recognize how strange this is. If Madison left voluntarily, even impulsively, she would have put on shoes. The pair that was missing was later identified as a pair of rubber-soled garden shoes that Madison wore to take out the trash and do yard work. They weren't shoes you'd choose to leave in. They were shoes you grabbed when you were going somewhere you hadn't planned on going. The department's response to this, when pressed, was that young people don't always think logically, which is true, but it's also the kind of answer that resolves nothing and forecloses no possibilities, and it sat uneasily with anyone who heard it. Weeks passed. The investigation, at least a visible portion of it, remained quiet. Claire's car was found about a week after her disappearance, parked on a gravel pullout along a state highway roughly 8 miles from Delwood. There were no signs of damage. The keys were not inside. The doors were unlocked. There was still a half-finished fountain drink in the cup holder, the ice long melted, the wax paper cup beginning to soften. The department processed the car and released almost no information about what, if anything, they found. A local reporter tried to obtain the processing report through a public records request. The request was partially fulfilled. She received the document with multiple sections redacted. The sections that remained visible indicated that the interior of the car had been examined and that a determination had been made that the car had been driven to its current location by the vehicle's registered driver. What this determination was based on was not included in the unredacted portion. At this point, investigators were left with two possibilities. Which one would you have believed? Either Claire drove her own car to that pullout, got out, and left. In which case, where did she go, and why did someone else have her keys? Or someone else drove the car there after she'd already been taken. In which case, whoever that person was had intimate knowledge of the area and enough time and confidence to place the car deliberately. Neither option makes a disappearance feel incidental. As fall moved into winter, the families began pushing harder. Claire's father contacted the Missouri State Highway Patrol and requested an independent review. Madison's mother appeared at a county commission meeting and asked, on the record, whether the department had made contact with all known sex offenders in the area and within a 50-mile radius. The answer she received was that investigators were pursuing all appropriate avenues, which is a kind of sentence that sounds like information and contains none. What the families found, when they began doing their own digging, with the help of a retired law enforcement officer who had grown up in Delwood and agreed to assist informally, was a series of record gaps that were unusual even by the standards of small, under-resourced county sheriff's department. The dental office's security camera, which pointed toward the parking lot and would have captured Claire's car and any vehicles nearby when she left, had its footage retained for a standard 30-day cycle. By the time anyone thought to request it in connection with the investigation, the footage of that day had been overwritten. This happens. It is not necessarily suspicious. But the timeline here is worth sitting with. Claire disappeared in early September. The request for footage wasn't made until late October. 7 weeks passed before anyone sought the one recording that would have shown what happened in the moments after Claire left the dental office. The department later said the delay was due to the initial assessment that the case might be a voluntary departure, which, again, is a plausible explanation. But it means that if there was a vehicle in that parking lot, a vehicle that followed Claire or approached her or that she got into, there is now no way to know. Around the same time, Madison's phone records were finally obtained and examined. Her phone, remember, had been left at the house charging. But phone records don't just show calls made from a device. They also show the device's connection history to cell towers, and what the records revealed was that the phone had remained stationary, connected to the same tower it always connected it from a house, from the time Madison's mother left for work until the time her mother came home and found the house empty. This meant, with reasonable certainty, that Madison had been gone long enough and far enough that taking her phone with her would have mattered, and she either knew this and left the phone intentionally, or she left in circumstances that didn't allow her to take it. The retired officer helping the families noted something else in those records. The phone received 2 text messages on the morning of Madison's disappearance. Both were from an unregistered number, what is sometimes called a burner phone. Neither message contained content that was ever shared publicly, but sources close to the family indicated that at least one of the messages appeared to reference a meeting location. When this information was brought to the sheriff's department, the department said it was already aware of the messages and that the number had been traced as far as was technically possible. The burner phone had been purchased with cash at a retail location. No further details were provided. By spring, the family's informal investigator had begun focusing on the county road that led toward the old farmhouse, not because he had any specific reason to at first, but because in the process of reviewing what parts of the county had or hadn't been searched, he noticed that a stretch of county road about 12 miles out of town had been marked on an early search grid as inaccessible due to seasonal conditions and had never been returned till once conditions improved. The notation had been made in October, when the roads in that area were genuinely difficult to navigate after heavy rains. But by November, and certainly by December, the roads were passable again. He drove the road himself in March. The farmhouse sat back from the road, mostly hidden by a long hedgerow of overgrown cedar trees. From the road, you wouldn't know it was there unless you were looking for it or had been there before. There was no visible smoke from the chimney, no signs of activity. He didn't approach. He noted the location and passed the information to the families. The families contacted the state police, not the local department. The state police conducted what they described as a welfare check on the property on a Thursday afternoon in January of the following year, 16 months after Claire and Madison had disappeared. What the officers found when they entered the farmhouse became the subject of an official incident report that has never been fully released. What is known from sources who were briefed on the initial response is this: both girls were inside. They were alive. They were in poor physical condition. Claire, who was now 18, had injuries consistent with prolonged confinement. Madison, who was 16, was visibly and significantly pregnant. The farmhouse contained supplies, food, water, basic utilities, in quantities suggesting that whoever had arranged this had planned for it to last a long time. There was evidence that at least one other person had been present in the building recently. Though the building was empty except for girls when officers entered, there was no one else there. Whoever had been with them was gone. The investigation that followed was handled primarily by the state police, with federal involvement requested through the Department of Justice given the nature of what had occurred. Specifically, the interstate elements that investigators believe were present, the extended timeline, and the condition of a minor. The local sheriff's department was not, according to sources, brought in as a primary partner in that phase of the investigation. This is a distinction worth pausing on. In most cases involving missing persons who are found within a county, the local department is deeply involved in the subsequent investigation. The decision to keep Harlow County's department at arm's length in the weeks following discovery raised questions that were never publicly addressed. Claire and Madison were hospitalized. Madison's baby, a boy, was born approximately 6 weeks after their rescue. The circumstances of the pregnancy, in terms of the investigation, were examined as a central piece of evidence. What investigators found or determined in that examination has not been made public. The father, or the identity of the father as established by any forensic examination, has not been disclosed in any official capacity. The girls themselves gave statements. Those statements have not been released. Their families have said, in the limited public comments they've made, that the girls are receiving care and that they have asked for privacy. Neither Claire nor Madison has spoken publicly about what happened in that farmhouse. It's possible they never will. There is one man who became the focus of significant scrutiny in the months following the discovery. We'll call him Ray Dunbar. He was in his mid-50s, had lived in Harlow County on and off for most of his life, and had what could be described as a complicated relationship with local authority, meaning he was known to law enforcement, had been cited and charged in minor matters over the years, and had a history of being involved in situations that attracted attention without ever resulting in serious consequence. He was not, at the time the girls disappeared, on any official watch list. He was not, as far as anyone knew, connected to either family. His name came up in the investigation because of a truck. A particular model and color pickup truck had been mentioned separately and without coordination by two different witnesses in the weeks after the disappearance. One who said they'd seen it near Claire's dental office on the morning she disappeared, and one who said they'd seen it parked on the county road near the farmhouse sometime in the prior autumn. Ray Dunbar owned a truck matching that description. He was interviewed. He denied any involvement. He provided an alibi for the morning of the disappearances that was, investigators noted, partially corroborated and partially not. He was not charged. He was not arrested. Within a few months of the investigation's most intensive phase, he moved out of Harlow County. His current whereabouts are not publicly known. The other thread, perhaps the more quietly troubling one, involved the farmhouse itself. County records indicate the property was purchased in the early 1980s by a family that sold it in the late 1990s. Since then, the ownership history is murky in a way that's unusual for a rural Missouri property. There were at least 2 transfers of interest in the parcel that appear in partial records but are not reflected in the standard chain of title at the county recorder's office. This could be clerical error. It could be something else. The retired officer who first identified the property attempted to trace the current legal owner and reached an impasse when the trail led to a limited liability company registered in another state, which had itself listed a registered agent that was dissolved in the early 2000s. Someone knew that farmhouse was there. Someone knew it was off the search grid. Someone had stocked it with enough supplies to sustain 2 people, 2 captive people, for over a year. These are not things that happen accidentally. What we know with confidence is relatively contained. 2 girls from a small Missouri town disappeared in September. They were found 16 months later in a farmhouse 12 miles from home. One was pregnant. At least one person had been present in the building regularly during their captivity and left before officers arrived. A man who owned a matching truck was identified, interviewed, and never charged. The farmhouse's ownership history contains gaps. A key piece of surveillance footage was allowed to expire before it was requested. Text messages from a burner phone were received by one of the girls the morning she disappeared. What we do not know is considerably larger. We don't know who took them. We don't know how. We don't know who occupied the farmhouse with them. We don't know the identity of the father of Madison's child. We don't know what's in those statements the girls gave. We don't know why the local department was sidelined. We don't know who owned that property. We don't know whether Ray Dunbar was involved or whether his truck being spotted twice was coincidence. We don't know what was in those redacted sections of the car processing report. There are people who believe this case is, in some form, ongoing, that charges are forthcoming, that the investigation has simply moved into a phase that requires patience and silence. That is possible. It has been said before in cases like this, and sometimes it has been true. There are others who believe that the combination of record gaps, department sidelining, and property ownership mystery points towards something more complicated, that people with local knowledge and local connections were involved, and that this created a different kind of difficulty for investigators than a simple abduction would have. This, too, is possible. It is not proven. It should not be stated as fact. What is harder to dispute is the feeling that settles in when you look at this case in its entirety. Not a feeling about any individual or institution, but but a feeling about what can happen in places where the systems of accountability are thin, where a county sheriff's department can make a determination about voluntary departure and let 7 weeks pass before anyone thinks to secure a security camera recording, where a road can be marked inaccessible in October and never returned to, where a farmhouse can sit 12 miles from town and hold 2 people for 16 months without anyone knowing, or, at minimum, without anyone saying. These things happened. They are not in dispute. Claire and Madison are alive. That is not a small thing. Many cases like this do not end with the people being found at all, let alone found alive. Whatever combination of survival, endurance, and circumstance kept them alive through those 16 months, that matters. It is a one part of the story that belongs entirely to them, and it is not something that any investigation, however incomplete, can diminish. But survival is not the same as justice. And finding someone is not the same as understanding what happened to them, or ensuring it cannot happen to someone else. The Ozarks are full of county roads, like the one that led to that farmhouse. Long, quiet, winding through timber and brush, largely forgotten outside the communities that built them. In most places, on most days, they are exactly what they appear to be. Rural infrastructure, nothing more. But every now and then, something about a case like this makes you wonder what's at the end of a road you've never thought to turn down. Not out of fear, but out of the recognition that the ordinary world has edges you don't always see coming until you're already at them. The questions in this case have not been resolved. Some of them may never be. The man with the truck has moved on. The farmhouse still stands, presumably, though what condition it's in now is unclear. The girls are somewhere rebuilding, slowly, unevenly, in the way that recovery from something like this actually works, which is nothing like how it looks in a movie and everything like how it feels to be human, and to have survived something you are not supposed to survive. Somewhere in Harlow County, there are people who know more than has been made public. That is almost always true in a case like this. Whether they have spoken to investigators, whether investigators have found them useful, whether what they know will ever become part of the public record, none of that is clear. Cases like this don't disappear. They just fade when people stop asking questions. If something about this story stayed with you, a detail, a gap, a question you can't quite let go of, leave it in the comments. The most important thing an audience can do is remember, because the people who count on these cases being forgotten know exactly how long they have to wait.